Ahoy again, it's me, Ron Gabaldon, audiobook narrator and erstwhile guy in a closet. Just wanted to say hi and let you know that I am uploading a new Kurt Vonnegut book, Hocus Pocus. This one, it's a real doozy, especially considering the stupid oligarchy that we live under now, the kind of dumb dystopia that we are all experiencing in this country at the moment. I think you're going to find it prescient, I think is the word. It's crazy how Kurt Vonnegut could be so prescient about how America does things. And it's really I think you're gonna enjoy it a lot. A bit of a heads up, there is a racial slur that is used at certain points throughout the book. I wanted to stay true to the word of the writing, so just let you know in advance so that no one's offended. Also, I don't intend to monetize this channel. I appreciate everyone who subscribes and watches these videos or listens to these recordings, but I have no intention of monetizing this channel. However, if you did want to support me, I don't have a Patreon, but I am an audiobook narrator on Audible.com. I know, Audible.com, right? Amazon, Jeff Bezos, ew, gross. But still, a lot of us are all subscribers of Audible, and it's how a lot of other people, a lot of other audiobook narrators like myself, make some money off of this craft. So if you could look me up on Audible and let other people know, share this, share the stuff, share this channel. Let everyone know that, hey, there's a guy who's doing Kurt Vonnegut books and he does them really great, and I really like listening to them, and you should too if you're into something. My latest audiobook on Audible is Daffodil from Truant D. Memphis. Really great, really fun, existential love story. I enjoyed this book. I really had fun doing it. Other books that I've got still out there, Death Gets a Book by Frank J. Edler. Look at that. Got a little thumbs up there from that. Thanks. Another one from the same author, Frank J. Edler, is A Death in Toledo, which is about a female death that has a unique problem when she has to claim a soul that has been claimed by a group of vampires, right? The undead versus death. How do you do that? Go check that one out. Also, Catcoin, a fictional history of a cryptocurrency, also by Frank J. Edler. Really fun, silly, got a lot of crazy voices in it. It's narrated by a cat. If you're into that, it's really fun. A bit of a retelling of the history of Bitcoin, of cryptocurrency, in a silly way. There's also a Haunted Hamburger House, which is on a different platform, and that one I think you may have to just look for. But thank you all very much for subscribing. Thank you all very much for enjoying these. I'm going to keep doing them because I enjoy doing it. It's good practice, and I love Kurt Vonnegut's work. So thank you all very much, and enjoy Hocus Pocus by Kurt Vonnegut. Hocus Pocus by Kurt Vonnegut. Part 1. Editor's Note through Chapter 5. Read by Ron Gabaldon. Editor's Note. The author of this book did not have access to writing paper of uniform size and quality. He wrote in a library housing some 800,000 volumes of interest to no one else. Most had never been read, and probably never would be read, so there was nothing to stop him from tearing out their blank end papers for stationery. This he did not do. Why he did not do this is not known. Whatever the reason, he wrote this book in pencil on everything from brown wrapping paper to the backs of business cards. The unconventional lines separating passages within chapters indicate where one scrap ended and the next began. The shorter the passage, the smaller the scrap. One can speculate that the author, fishing through trash for anything to write on, may have hoped to establish a reputation for humility or insanity, since he was facing trial. It is equally likely, though, that he began this book impulsively, having no idea it would become a book, scribbling words on a scrap which happened to be right at hand. It could be that he found it congenial then to continue on from scrap to scrap, as though each were a bottle for him to fill. When he filled one up, possibly, no matter what its size, he could satisfy himself that he had written everything there was to write about this or that. He numbered all the pages, so there could be no doubt about their being sequential, nor about his hope that someone, undaunted by their disreputable appearance, would read them as a book. He in fact says here and there, with increasing confidence as he nears the end, that what he is doing is writing a book. There are several drawings of a tombstone. The author made only one such drawing. The others are tracings of the original, probably made by superimposing translucent pieces of paper and pressing them against a sunlit library window pane. He wrote words on the face of each burial marker, and in one case, simply a question mark. These did not reproduce well on the printed page, so they have been set in type instead. The author himself is responsible for the capitalization of certain words whose initial letters a meticulous editor might prefer to see in lower case. So too did Eugene Debs Hartke choose for various reasons unexplained to let numbers stand for themselves, except at the heads of sentences, rather than put them into words. For example, numeral 2 instead of 2, TWO. He may have felt that numbers lost much of their potency when diluted by an alphabet. To virtually all of his idiosyncrasies, I, after much thought, have applied what another author once told me was the most sacred word in a great editor's vocabulary. That word is stet. KV. This work of pure fiction is dedicated to the memory of Eugene Victor Debs, 1855 to 1926. While there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. While there is a soul in prison, I am not free. 1. My name is Eugene Debs Hartke, and I was born in 1940. I was named at the behest of my maternal grandfather, Benjamin Wills, who was a socialist and an atheist, and nothing but a groundskeeper at Butler University in Indianapolis, Indiana, in honor of Eugene Debs of Terre Haute, Indiana. Debs was a socialist and a pacifist, and a labor organizer who ran several times for the presidency of the United States of America, and got more votes than has any other candidate nominated by a third party in the history of this country. Debs died in 1926, when I was a negative 14 years of age. The year is 2001 now. If all had gone the way a lot of people thought it would, Jesus Christ would have been among us again, and the American flag would have been planted on Venus and Mars. No such luck. At least the world will end, an event anticipated with great joy by many. It will end very soon, but not in the year 2000, which has come and gone. From that, I conclude that God Almighty is not heavily into numerology. Grandfather Benjamin Wills died in 1948, when I was a +8 years of age, but not before he made sure that I knew by heart the most famous words uttered by Debs, which are, "While there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. While there is a soul in prison, I am not free." I, Deb's namesake, however, became anything but a bleeding heart. From the time I was 21 until I was 35, I was a professional soldier, a commissioned officer in the United States Army. During those 14 years, I would have killed Jesus Christ himself, or herself, or itself, or whatever, if ordered to do so by a superior officer. At the abrupt and humiliating and dishonorable end of the Vietnam War, I was a lieutenant colonel, with thousands and thousands of my own inferiors. During that war, which was about nothing but the ammunition business, there was a microscopic possibility, I suppose, that I called in a white phosphorus barrage or a napalm airstrike on a returning Jesus Christ. I never wanted to be a professional soldier, although I turned out to be a good one, if there can be such a thing. The idea that I should go to West Point came up as unexpectedly as the finale of the Vietnam War, near the end of my senior year in high school. I was all set to go to the University of Michigan and take courses in English and history and political science, and work on the student daily paper there in preparation for a career as a journalist. But all of a sudden, my father, who was a chemical engineer involved in making plastics with a half-life of 50,000 years, and as full of excrement as a Christmas turkey, said I should go to West Point instead. He had never been in the military himself. During World War II, he was too valuable as a civilian deep thinker about chemicals to be put in a soldier suit and turned into a suicidal, homicidal imbecile in 13 weeks. I had already been accepted by the University of Michigan when this offer to me of an appointment to the United States Military Academy came out of the blue. The offer arrived at a low point in my father's life, when he needed something to boast about which would impress our simple-minded neighbors. They would think an appointment to West Point was a great prize, like being picked for a professional baseball team. So he said to me, as I used to say to infantry replacements fresh off the boat or plane in Vietnam, "This is a great opportunity." What I would really like to have been, given a perfect world, is a jazz pianist. I mean jazz. I don't mean rock and roll. I mean the never the same way twice music the American black people gave the world. I played piano in my own all-white band in my all-white high school in Midland City, Ohio. We called ourselves the Soul Merchants. How good were we? We had to play white people's popular music, or nobody would have hired us. But every so often, we would cut loose with jazz anyway. Nobody else seemed to notice the difference, but we sure did. We fell in love with ourselves. We were in ecstasy. Father should never have made me go to West Point. Never mind what he did to the environment with his non-biodegradable plastics. Look what he did to me. What a boob he was. And my mother agreed with every decision he ever made, which makes her another blithering nincompoop. They were both killed 20 years ago in a freak accident in a gift shop on the Canadian side of Niagara Falls, which the Indians in this valley used to call Thunder Beaver, when the roof fell in. There are no dirty words in this book, except for hell and God, in case someone is fearing that an innocent child might see one. The expression I will use here and there for the end of the Vietnam War, for example, will be, "when the excrement hit the air conditioning." Perhaps the only precept taught me by Grandfather Wills that I have honored all my adult life is that profanity and obscenity entitle people who don't want unpleasant information to close their ears and eyes to you. The more alert soldiers who served under me in Vietnam would comment in some amazement that I never used profanity, which made me unlike anybody else they had ever met in the Army. They might ask if this was because I was religious. I would reply that religion had nothing to do with it. I am, in fact, pretty much an atheist, like my mother's father, although I kept that to myself. Why argue somebody else out of the expectation of some sort of an afterlife? I don't use profanity, I would say, because your life and the lives of those around you may depend on your understanding what I tell you. Okay? Okay? I resigned my commission in 1975, after the excrement hit the air conditioning. Not failing, however, to father a son on my way home, unknowingly during a brief stopover in the Philippines. I thought surely that the subsequent mother, a young female war correspondent for the Des Moines Register, was using foolproof birth control. Wrong again. Booby traps everywhere. The biggest booby trap fate set for me, though, was a pretty and personable young woman named Margaret Patton, who allowed me to woo and marry her soon after my graduation from West Point, and then had 2 children by me without telling me that there was a powerful strain of insanity on her mother's side of her family. So then her mother, who was living with us, went insane. And then she herself went insane. Our children, moreover, had every reason to suspect that they, too, might go crazy in middle age. Our children, full grown now, can never forgive us for reproducing. What a mess. I realize that my speaking of my first and only wife as something as inhuman as a booby trap risks my seeming to be yet another infernal device. But many other women have had no trouble relating to me as a person, and ardently too, and my interest in them has gone well beyond the merely mechanical. Almost invariably, I have been as enchanted by their souls, their intellects, and the stories of their lives as by their amorous propensities. But after I came home from the Vietnam War, and before either Margaret or her mother had shown me and the children and the neighbors great big symptoms of their inherited craziness, that mother and daughter team treated me like some sort of boring but necessary electrical appliance, like a vacuum cleaner. Good things have also happened unexpectedly. Manna from heaven, you might want to call them. But not in such quantities as to make life a bowl of cherries or anything approaching that. Right after my war, when I had no idea what to do with the rest of my life, I ran into a former commanding officer of mine who had become president of Tarkington College in Scipio, New York. I was then only 35, and my wife was still sane, and my mother-in-law was only slightly crazy. He offered me a teaching job, which I accepted. I could accept that job with a clear conscience. Despite my lack of academic credentials beyond a mere BS degree from West Point, since all the students at Tarkington were learning disabled in some way, or plain stupid, or comatose, or whatever. No matter what the subject, my old CO assured me, I would have little trouble keeping ahead of them. The particular subject he wanted me to teach, what's more, was one in which I had excelled at the academy, which was physics. The greatest stroke of luck for me, the biggest chunk of manna from heaven, was that Tarkington had need of somebody to play the Lutz Carillon, the great family of bells at the top of the tower of the college library where I am writing now. I asked my old CO if the bells were swung by ropes. He said they used to be, but that they had been electrified and were played by means of a keyboard now. "What does the keyboard look like?" I said. "Like a piano," he said. I had never played bells. Very few people have that clanging opportunity, but I could play a piano. So I said, "Shake hands with your new carillonneur." The happiest moments in my life, without question, were when I played the Lutz Carillon at the start and end of every day. I went to work at Tarkington 25 years ago, and have lived in this beautiful valley ever since. This is home. I have been a teacher here. I was a warden for a little while, after Tarkington College officially became Tarkington State Reformatory in June of 1999, 20 months ago. Now, I myself am a prisoner here, but with pretty much the run of the place. I haven't been convicted of anything yet. I am awaiting trial, which I guess will take place in Rochester, for supposedly having masterminded the mass prison break at the New York State Maximum Security Adult Correctional Institution at Athena, across the lake from here. It turns out that I also have tuberculosis, and my poor addled wife Margaret and her mother have been put by court order into a lunatic asylum in Batavia, New York, something I had never had the guts to do. I am so powerless and despised now that the man I am named after, Eugene Debs, if he were still alive, might at last be somewhat fond of me. 2. In more optimistic times, when it was not widely understood that human beings were killing the planet with the byproducts of their own ingenuity, and that a new ice age had begun in any case, the generic name for the sort of horse-drawn covered wagon that carried freight and settlers across the prairies of what was to become the United States of America, and eventually across the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean, was Conestoga, since the first of these were built in the Conestoga Valley of Pennsylvania. They kept the pioneers supplied with cigars, among other things, so that cigars nowadays, in the year 2001, are still called stogies sometimes, which is short for Conestoga. By 1830, the sturdiest and most popular of these wagons were in fact made by the Mohiga Wagon Company, right here in Scipio, New York, at the pinched waist of Lake Mohiga, the deepest and coldest and westernmost of the long and narrow Finger Lakes. So, sophisticated cigar smokers might want to stop calling their stink bombs stogies and call them mogies or higgles instead. The founder of the Mohiga Wagon Company was Aaron Tarkington, a brilliant inventor and manufacturer who nevertheless could not read or write. He now would be identified as a blameless inheritor of the genetic defect known as dyslexia. He said of himself that he was like the Emperor Charlemagne, too busy to learn to read and write. He was not too busy, however, to have his wife read to him for 2 hours every evening. He had an excellent memory, for he delivered weekly lectures to the workmen at the factory that were laced with lengthy quotations from Shakespeare and Homer and the Bible, and on and on. He sired 4 children, a son and 3 daughters, all of whom could read and write. But they still carried the gene of dyslexia, which would disqualify several of their own descendants from getting very far in conventional schemes of education. Two of Aaron Tarkington's children were so far from being dyslexic, in fact, as to themselves write books, which I have only read now, which nobody probably will ever read again. Aaron's only son, Elias, wrote a technical account of the construction of the Onondaga Canal, which connected the northern end of Lake Mohiga to the Erie Canal just south of Rochester. And the youngest daughter, Felicia, wrote a novel called Carpathia, about a headstrong, high-born young woman in the Mohiga Valley who fell in love with a half-Indian lock tender on that same canal. That canal is all filled in and paved over now, and is Route 53, which forks at the head of the lake, where the locks used to be. One fork heads southwest through farm country to Scipio. The other leads southeast through the perpetual gloom of the Iroquois National Forest to the bald hilltop crowned by the battlements of the New York State Maximum Security Adult Correctional Institution at Athena, a hamlet directly across the lake from Scipio. Bear with me. This is history. I am trying to explain how this valley, this verdant cul-de-sac, got to be what it is today. All three of Aaron Tarkington's daughters married into prosperous and enterprising families in Cleveland, New York, and Wilmington, Delaware, innocently making the threat of dyslexia pandemic in an emerging ruling class of bankers and industrialists, largely displaced in my time by Germans, Koreans, Italians, English, and of course, Japanese. The son of Aaron, Elias, remained in Scipio and took over his father's properties, adding to them a brewery and a steam-driven carpet factory, the first such in the state. There was no water power in Scipio, whose industrial prosperity until the introduction of steam was based not on cheap energy and locally available raw materials, but on inventiveness and high standards of workmanship. Elias Tarkington never married. He was severely wounded at the age of 54 while a civilian observer at the Battle of Gettysburg, top hat and all. He was there to see the debuts of two of his inventions, a mobile field kitchen and a pneumatic recoil mechanism for heavy artillery. The field kitchen, incidentally, with slight modifications, would later be adopted by the Barnum and Bailey Circus, and then by the German Army during World War I. Elias Tarkington was a tall and skinny man with chin whiskers and a stovepipe hat. He was shot through the right chest at Gettysburg, but not fatally. The man who shot him was one of the few Confederate soldiers to reach the Union lines during Pickett's charge. That Johnny Reb died in ecstasy among his enemies, believing that he had shot Abraham Lincoln. A crumbling newspaper account I have found here in what used to be the college library, which is now the prison library, gives his last words as follows: "Go home, bluebellies. Old Satan's dead." During my 3 years in Vietnam, I certainly heard plenty of last words by dying American foot soldiers. Not one of them, however, had illusions that he had somehow accomplished something worthwhile in the process of making the supreme sacrifice. One boy, of only 18, said to me while he was dying and I was holding him in my arms, "Dirty joke, dirty joke." 3. Elias Tarkington, the severely wounded Abraham Lincoln look-alike, was brought home in one of his own wagons to Scipio, to his estate overlooking the town and lake. He was not well educated, and was more a mechanic than a scientist, and so spent his last 3 years trying to invent what anyone familiar with Newton's laws would have known was an impossibility: a perpetual motion machine. He had no fewer than 27 contraptions built, which he foolishly expected to go on running after he had given them an initial spin or whack until Judgment Day. I found 19 of those stubborn, mocking machines in the attic of what used to be their inventor's mansion, which in my time was the home of the college president, about 1 year after I came to work at Tarkington. I brought them back downstairs and into the 20th century. Some of my students and I cleaned them up and restored any parts that had deteriorated during the intervening 100 years. At the least, they were exquisite jewelry, with garnets and amethysts for bearings, with arms and legs of exotic woods, with tumbling balls of ivory, with chutes and counterweights of silver. It was as though dying Elias hoped to overwhelm science with the magic of precious materials. The longest my students and I could get the best of them to run was 51 seconds. Some eternity! To me, and I passed this on to my students, the restored devices demonstrated not only how quickly anything on Earth runs down without steady infusions of energy, they reminded us, too, of the craftsmanship no longer practiced in the town below. Nobody down there in our time could make things that cunning and beautiful. Yes, and we took the 10 machines we agreed were the most beguiling, and we put them on permanent exhibit in the foyer of this library, underneath a sign whose words can surely be applied to this whole ruined planet nowadays. The complicated futility of ignorance. I have discovered from reading old newspapers and letters and diaries from back then that the men who built the machines for Elias Tarkington knew from the first that they would never work, whatever the reason. Yet what love they lavished on the materials that comprised them! How is this for a definition of high art? Making the most of the raw materials of futility. Still another perpetual motion machine envisioned by Elias Tarkington was what his last will and testament called the Mohiga Valley Free Institute. Upon his death, this new school would take possession of his 3,000-hectare estate above Scipio, plus half the shares in the wagon company, the carpet company, and the brewery. The other half was already owned by his sisters far away. On his deathbed, he predicted that Scipio would one day be a great metropolis, and that its wealth would transform his little college into a university to rival Harvard and Oxford and Heidelberg. It was to offer a free college education to persons of either sex, and of any age or race or religion, living within 40 miles of Scipio. Those from farther away would pay a modest fee. In the beginning, it would have only one full-time employee, the president. The teachers would be recruited right here in Scipio. They would take a few hours off from work each week to teach what they knew. The chief engineer at the wagon company, for example, whose name was André Lutz, was a native of Liège, Belgium, and had served as an apprentice to a bell founder there. He would teach chemistry. His French wife would teach French and watercolor painting. The brewmaster at the brewery, Hermann Schultz, a native of Leipzig, would teach botany and German and the flute. The Episcopalian priest, Dr. Alan Clues, a graduate of Harvard, would teach Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and the Bible. The dying man's physician, Dalton Polk, would teach biology and Shakespeare, and so on. And it came to pass. In 1869, the new college enrolled its first class, 9 students in all, and all from right here in Scipio. 4 were of ordinary college age. 1 was a Union veteran who had lost his legs at Shiloh. 1 was a former black slave, 40 years old. 1 was a spinster, 82 years old. The first president was only 26 years old, a schoolteacher from Athena, 2 kilometers by water from Scipio. There was no prison over there back then, but only a slate quarry and a sawmill and a few subsistence farms. His name was John Peck. He was a cousin of the Tarkingtons. His branch of the family, however, was, and remains, unhampered by dyslexia. He has numerous descendants in the present day, one of whom, in fact, is a speechwriter for the Vice President of the United States. Young John Peck and his wife and 2 children and his mother-in-law arrived at Scipio by rowboat, with Peck and his wife at the oars, their children seated in the stern, and their luggage and the mother-in-law in another boat they towed behind. They took up residence on the 3rd floor of what had been Elias Tarkington's mansion. The rooms on the first 2 floors would be classrooms, a library, which was already a library with 280 volumes collected by the Tarkingtons, study halls, and a dining room. Many treasures from the past were taken up to the attic to make room for the new activities. Among these were the failed perpetual motion machines. They would gather dust and cobwebs until 1978, when I found them up there and realized what they were, and brought them down the stairs again. 1 week before the first class was held, which was in Latin, taught by the Episcopalian priest Alan Clues, André Lutz, the Belgian, arrived at the mansion with 3 wagons carrying a very heavy cargo. A carillon consisting of 32 bells. He had cast them on his own time and at his own expense in the wagon factory's foundry. They were made from mingled Union and Confederate rifle barrels and cannonballs and bayonets gathered up after the Battle of Gettysburg. They were the first bells, and surely the last bells, ever to be cast in Scipio. Nothing, in my opinion, will ever again be cast in Scipio. No industrial arts of any sort will ever again be practiced here. André Lutz gave the new college all those bells, even though there was no place to hang them. He said he did it because he was so sure that it would one day be a great university with a bell tower and everything. He was dying of emphysema as a result of the fumes from molten metals that he had been breathing since he was 10 years old. He had no time to wait for a place to hang the most wonderful consequence of his having been alive for a little while, which was all those bells, bells, bells. They were no surprise. They had been 18 months in the making. The founders whose work he supervised had shared his dreams of immortality as they made things as impractical and beautiful as bells, bells, bells. So, all the bells but one from the middle octave were slathered with grease to prevent their rusting and stored in 4 ranks in the estate's great barn, 200 meters from the mansion. The one bell that was going to get to sing at once was installed in the cupola of the mansion with its rope running all the way down to the 1st floor. It would call people to classes and, if need be, also serve as a fire alarm. The rest of the bells, it turned out, would slumber in the loft for 30 years, until 1899, when they were hanged as a family, the one from the cupola included, on axles in the belfry of the tower of a splendid library given to the school by the Mellencamp family of Cleveland. The Mellencamp's were also Tarkingtons, since the founder of their fortune had married a daughter of the illiterate Aaron Tarkington. 11 of them so far had been dyslexic, and they had all gone to college in Scipio, since no other institution of higher learning would take them in. The first Mellencamp to graduate from here was Henry, who enrolled in 1875 when he was 19, and when the school was only 6 years old. It was at that time that its name was changed to Tarkington College. I have found the crumbling minutes of the Board of Trustees meeting at which that name change was made. 3 of the 6 trustees were men who had married daughters of Aaron Tarkington, one of them the grandfather of Henry Mellencamp. The other 3 trustees were the mayor of Scipio and a lawyer who looked after the Tarkington daughters' interests in the valley, and the area congressman, who was surely the sisters' faithful servant too, since they were partners with the college in his district's most important industries. And according to the minutes, which fell apart in my hands as I read them, it was the grandfather of young Henry Mellencamp who proposed the name change, saying that the Mohiga Valley Free Institute sounded too much like a poorhouse or a hospital. It is my guess that he would not have minded having the place sound like a catchment for the poor, if only he had not suffered the misfortune of having his own grandson go there. It was in that same year, 1875, that work began across the lake from Scipio on a hilltop above Athena on a prison camp for young criminals from big city slums. It was believed that fresh air and the wonders of nature would improve their souls and bodies to the point that they would find it natural to be good citizens. When I came to work at Tarkington, there were only 300 students, a number that hadn't changed for 50 years. But the rustic work camp across the lake had become a brutal fortress of iron and masonry on a naked hilltop. The New York State Maximum Security Adult Correctional Institution at Athena, keeping 5,000 of the state's worst criminals under lock and key. 2 years ago, Tarkington still only had 300 students, but the population of the prison, under hideously overcrowded conditions, had grown to 10,000. And then, one cold winter's night, it became the scene of the biggest prison break in American history. Until then, nobody had ever escaped from Athena. Suddenly, everybody was free to leave, and to take a weapon from the prison armory, too, if he had a use for one. The lake between the prison and the little college was frozen solid, as easily traversed as the parking lot of a great shopping mall. What next? Yes, and by the time Andre Lutz's bells were at last made to sing as a carillon, Tarkington College had not only a new library, but luxurious dormitories, a science building, an art building, a chapel, a theater, a dining hall, an administration building, 2 new buildings of classrooms, and athletic facilities that were the envy of the institutions with which it had begun to compete in track and fencing and swimming and baseball, which were Hobart, the University of Rochester, Cornell, Union, Amherst, and Bucknell. These structures bore the names of wealthy families as grateful as the Mellencamps for all the college had managed to do for offspring of theirs whom conventional colleges had deemed ineducable. Most were related to the Mellencamps or to anyone who carried the Tarkington gene of dyslexia. Nor were the young they sent to Tarkington necessarily troubled by dyslexia. All sorts of things were wrong with them, including an inability to write legibly with pen and ink, although what they tried to write down made perfect sense, and stammering so severe as to prevent their saying a word in class, and petite mal, which caused their minds to go perfectly blank for seconds or minutes, anywhere, anytime, and so on. It was simply the Mellencamp's who first challenged the new little college to do what it could for a seemingly hopeless case of plutocratic juvenile incapacity, namely Henry. Not only would Henry graduate with honors from Tarkington, he would go on to Oxford, taking with him a male companion who read aloud to him and wrote down thoughts Henry could only express orally. Henry would become one of the most brilliant speakers in a golden age of American purple bow-wow oratory, and serve as a congressman and then a United States Senator from Ohio for 36 years. That same Henry Mellencamp was author of the lyrics to one of the most popular turn-of-the-century ballads, Mary, Mary, Where Have You Gone? The melody of that ballad was composed by Henry's friend, Paul Dresser, brother of the novelist Theodore Dreiser. This was one of the rare instances in which Dresser set another man's words to music instead of his own. And then Henry appropriated that tune and wrote, or rather dictated, new words which sentimentalized student life in this valley. Thus was Mary, Mary, Where Have You Gone? Transmogrified into the alma mater of this campus, until it became a penitentiary 2 years ago. History. Accident after accident made Tarkington what it is today. Who would dare to predict what it would be in 2021, only 20 years from now? The two prime movers in the universe are time and luck. As the tagline of my favorite dirty joke would have it, keep your hat on. We could wind up miles from here. If Henry Mellencamp had not come out of his mother's womb dyslexic, Tarkington College wouldn't even have been called Tarkington College. It would have gone on being the Mohiga Valley Free Institute, which would have died right along with the wagon factory and the carpet factory and the brewery when the railroads and highways connecting the east and west were built far to the north and south of Scipio, so as not to bridge the lake, so as not to have to penetrate the deep and dark virgin hardwood forest, now the Iroquois National Forest, to the east and south of here. If Henry Mellencamp hadn't come out of his mother's womb dyslexic, and if that mother hadn't been a Tarkington and so known about the little college on Lake Mohiga, this library never would have been built, and filled with 800,000 bound volumes. When I was a professor here, that was 70,000 more bound volumes than Swarthmore College had. Among small colleges, this library used to be second only to the one at Oberlin, which had 1 million bound volumes. So, what is this structure in which I sit now, thanks to time and luck? It is nothing less, friends and neighbors, than the greatest prison library in the history of crime and punishment. It is very lonely in here. Hello? Hello? I might have said the same sort of thing back when this was an 800,000 bound volume college library. It is very lonely in here. Hello? Hello? I have just looked up Harvard University. It has 13 million bound volumes now. What a read! And almost every book written for or about the ruling class. If Henry Mellencamp hadn't come out of his mother's womb dyslexic, there would never have been a tower in which to hang the Lutz Carillon. Those bells might never have gotten to reverberate in the valley or anywhere. They probably would have been melted up and made back into weapons during World War I. If Henry Mellencamp had not come out of his mother's womb dyslexic, These heights above Scipio might have been all darkness on the cold winter night 2 years ago, with Lake Mohiga frozen hard as a parking lot, when 10,000 prisoners at Athena were suddenly set free. Instead, there was a little galaxy of beckoning lights up here. 4. Regardless of whether Henry Mellencamp came out of his mother's womb dyslexic or not, I was born in Wilmington, Delaware, 18 months before this country joined the fighting in World War II. I have not seen Wilmington since. That is where they keep my birth certificate. I was the only child of a housewife and, as I've said, a chemical engineer. My father was then employed by E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company, a manufacturer of high explosives, among other things. When I was 2 years old, we moved to Midland City, Ohio, where a washing machine company named Robo Magic Corporation was beginning to make bomb release mechanisms and swivel mounts for machine guns on B-17 bombers. The plastics industry was then in its infancy, and Father was sent to Robo Magic to determine what synthetic materials from DuPont could be used in the weapons systems in place of metal, in order to make them lighter. By the time the war was over, the company had gotten out of the washing machine business entirely, had changed its name to Barrytron Limited, and was making weapon, airplane, and motor vehicle parts composed of plastics it had developed on its own. My father had become the company's vice president in charge of research and development. When I was about 17, DuPont bought Barrytron in order to capture several of its patents. One of the plastics Father had helped to develop, I remember, had the ability to scatter radar signals, so that an airplane clad in it would look like a flock of geese to our enemies. This material, which has since been used to make virtually indestructible skateboards and crash helmets and skis and motorcycle fenders and so on, was an excuse, when I was a boy, for increasing security precautions at Barrytron. To keep communists from finding out how it was made, a single fence topped with barbed wire was no longer adequate. A second fence was put outside of that one, and the space between them was patrolled around the clock by humorless, jack-booted armed guards with lean and hungry Dobermans. When DuPont took over Barrytron, the double fence, the Dobermans, my father and all, I was a high school senior, all set to go to the University of Michigan to learn how to be a journalist, to serve John Q. Public's right to know. 2 members of my 6-piece band, the Soul Merchants, the clarinet and the string bass, were also going to Michigan. We were going to stick together and go on making music at Ann Arbor. Who knows? We might have become so popular that we went on world tours and made great fortunes and been superstars at peace rallies and love-ins when the Vietnam War came along. Cadets at West Point did not make music. The musicians in the dance band and the marching band were regular Army enlisted men, members of the servant class. They were under orders to play music as written, note for note, and never mind how they felt about music or about anything. For that matter, there wasn't any student publication at West Point, so never mind how the cadets felt about anything. Not interesting. I was fine, but all kinds of things were going wrong with my father's life. DuPont was looking him over, as they were looking over everybody at Barrytron, deciding whether to keep him on or not. He was also having a love affair with a married woman whose husband caught him in the act and beat him up. This was a sensitive subject with my parents, naturally, so I never discussed it with them. But the story was all over town, and Father had a black eye. He didn't play any sports, so he had to make up a story about falling down the basement stairs. Mother weighed about 90 kilograms by then, and berated him all the time about his having sold all his Berrytron stock 2 years too soon. If he had hung on to it until the DuPont takeover, he would have had $1 million, back when it meant something to be a millionaire. If I had been learning disabled, he could easily have afforded to send me to Tarkington. Unlike me, he was the sort of man who had to be in extremis in order to commit adultery. According to a story I heard from enemies at high school, Father had done the jumping out the window thing, hippity-hopping like Peter Cottontail across backyards, with his pants around his ankles, and getting bitten by a dog, and getting tangled up in a clothesline, and all the rest of it. That could have been an exaggeration. I never asked. I myself was deeply troubled by our little family's image problem, which was complicated when Mother broke her nose 2 days after Father got the black eye. To the outside world, it looked as though she had said something to Father about the reason he had a black eye, and his reply had been to slug her. I didn't think he would ever slug her, no matter what. There is a not quite remote possibility that he really did slug her, of course. Lesser men would have slugged her under similar circumstances. The real truth of the matter became unavailable to historians forever when the falling ceiling of a gift shop on the Canadian side of Niagara Falls killed both participants, as I've said, some 20 years ago. They were said to have died instantly. They never knew what hit them, which is the best way to go. There was no argument about that in Vietnam, or, I suppose, on any battlefield. One kid, I remember, stepped on an anti-personnel mine. The mine could have been one of our own. His best friend from basic training asked him what he could do for him, and the kid replied, "Turn me off like a light bulb, Sam." The dying kid was white. The kid who wanted to help him was black, or a light tan, actually. His features were practically white, you would have to say. A woman I was making love to a few years ago asked me if my parents were still alive. She wanted to know more about me, now that we had our clothes off. I told her that they had suffered violent deaths in a foreign country, which was true. Canada is a foreign country. But then I heard myself spinning this fantastic tale of their being on a safari in Tanganyika, a place about which I know almost nothing. I told that woman, and she believed me, that my parents and their guide were shot by poachers who were killing elephants for their ivory and mistook them for game wardens. I said that the poachers put their bodies on top of anthills so that their skeletons were soon picked clean. They could be positively identified only by their dental work. I used to find it easy and even exhilarating to lie that elaborately. I don't anymore. And I wonder now if I didn't develop that unwholesome habit very young, and because my parents were such an embarrassment. And especially my mother, who was fat enough to be a circus freak. I described much more attractive parents than I really had, in order to make people who knew nothing about them think well of me. And during my final year in Vietnam, when I was in public information, I found it as natural as breathing to tell the press and replacements fresh off the boats or planes that we were clearly winning, and that the folks back home should be proud and happy about all the good things we were doing there. I learned to lie like that in high school. Another thing I learned in high school that was helpful in Vietnam: alcohol and marijuana, if used in moderation, plus loud, usually low-class music, make stress and boredom infinitely more bearable. It was manna from heaven that I came into this world with a gift for moderation in my intake of mood-modifying substances. During my last 2 years in high school, I don't think my parents even suspected that I was half in the bag a lot of the time. All they ever complained about was the music. When I played the radio or the phonograph, or when the Soul Merchants rehearsed in our basement, which Mom and Dad said was jungle music and much too loud. In Vietnam, the music was always much too loud. Practically everybody was half in the bag, including chaplains. Several of the most gruesome accidents I had to explain to the press during my last year over there were caused by people who had rendered themselves imbecilic or maniacal by ingesting too much of what, if taken in moderation, could be a helpful chemical. I ascribed all such accidents, of course, to human error. The press understood. Who on this earth hasn't made a mistake or two? The assassination of an Austrian archduke led to World War I, and probably to World War II as well. Just as surely, my father's black eye brought me to the sorry state in which I find myself today. He was looking for some way, almost any way, to recapture the respect of the community and to attract favorable attention from Barrytron's new owner, DuPont. DuPont, of course, has now been taken over by IG Farben of Germany, the same company that manufactured and packaged and labeled and addressed the cyanide gas used to kill civilians of all ages, including babes in arms, during the Holocaust. What a planet. So, Father, his injured eye looking like a slit in a purple and yellow omelet, asked me if I was likely to receive any sort of honors at high school graduation. He didn't say so, but he was frantic for something to brag about at work. He was so desperate that he was trying to get blood out of the turnip of my non-participation in high school sports, student government, or school-sponsored extracurricular activities. My grade average was high enough to get me into the University of Michigan, and on the honor roll now and then, but not into the National Honor Society. It was so pitiful. It made me mad, too, because he was trying to make me partly responsible for the family's image problem, which was all his fault. I was always sorry you didn't go out for football, he said, as though a touchdown would have made everything all right again. It's too late now, I said. You let those 4 years slip by without doing anything but making jungle music, he said. It occurs to me now, a mere 43 years later, that I might have said to him that at least I managed my sex life better than he managed his. I was getting laid all the time, thanks to jungle music, and so were the other soul merchants. Certain sorts of not just girls, but full-grown women, too, found us glamorous free spirits up on the bandstand, imitating black people and smoking marijuana, and loving ourselves when we made music, and laughing about God knows what just about any time. I guess my love life is over now. Even if I could get out of prison, I wouldn't want to give some trusting woman tuberculosis. She would be scared to death of getting AIDS, and I would give her TB instead. Wouldn't that be nice? So now, I will have to make do with memories. As a prosthesis for my memory, I have begun to list all the women, excluding my wife and prostitutes, with whom I have gone all the way, as we used to say in high school. I find it impossible to remember any conquest I made as a teenager with clarity, to separate fact from fantasy. It was all a dream. So, I begin my list with Shirley Kern, to whom I made love when I was 20. Shirley is my datum. How many names will there be on the list? Too early to tell, but wouldn't that number, whatever it turns out to be as good a thing as any to put on my tombstone as an enigmatic epitaph. I am certainly sorry if I ruined the lives of any of those women who believed me when I said I loved them. I can only hope against hope that Shirley Kern and all the rest of them are still okay. If it's any consolation to those who may not be okay, my own life was ruined by a science fair. Father asked me if there wasn't some school-sponsored extracurricular activity I could still try out for. This was only 8 weeks before my graduation. So I said, in a spirit of irony, since he knew science did not delight me as it delighted him, that my last opportunity to amount to anything was the county science fair. I got B's in physics and chemistry, but you could stuff those subjects up your fundament as far as I was concerned. But Father rose from his chair in a state of sick excitement. "Let's go down to the basement," he said. "There's work to do." "What kind of work?" I said. This was about midnight. And he said, "You're going to enter and win the science fair." Which I did. Or rather, Father entered and won the science fair, requiring only that I sign an affidavit swearing that the exhibit was all my own work, and that I memorize his explanation of what it proved. It was about crystals and how they grew and why they grew. His competition was weak. He was, after all, a 43-year-old chemical engineer with 20 years in industry, taking on teenagers in a community where few parents had higher educations. The main business in the county back then was still agriculture, corn and pigs and beef cattle. Barytron was the sole sophisticated industry, and only a handful of people such as Father understood its processes and apparatus. Most of the company's employees were content to do what they were told and incurious as to how it was exactly that they had worked the miracles that somehow arrived all packaged and labeled and addressed on the loading docks. I am reminded now of dead American soldiers, teenagers mostly, all packaged and labeled and addressed on loading docks in Vietnam. How many people knew or cared how these curious artifacts were actually manufactured? A few. Why Father and I were not branded as swindlers, why my exhibit was not thrown out of the science fair, why I am a prisoner awaiting trial now instead of a star reporter for the Korean owners of the New York Times, has to do with compassion, I now believe. The feeling was general in the community, I think, that our little family had suffered enough. Nobody in the county gave much of a darn about science anyway. The other exhibits were so dumb and pitiful, too, that the best of them would make the county look stupid if it and its honest creator went on to the statewide competition in Cleveland. Our exhibit sure looked slick and tidy. Another big plus from the judge's point of view, maybe, when they thought about what the county's best was going to be up against in Cleveland, our exhibit was extremely hard for an ordinary person to understand or find at all interesting. I remained philosophical, thanks to marijuana and alcohol, while the community decided whether to crucify me as a fraud or to crown me as a genius. Father may have had a buzz on, too. Sometimes it's hard to tell. I served under 2 generals in Vietnam who drank a quart of whiskey a day, but it was hard to detect. They always looked so serious and dignified. So off Father and I went to Cleveland. His spirits were high. I knew we would go smash up there. I don't know why he didn't know we would go smash up there. The only advice he gave me was to keep my shoulders back when I was explaining my exhibit, and not to smoke where the judges might see me doing it. He was talking about ordinary cigarettes. He didn't know I smoked the other kind. I make no apologies for having been zapped during my darkest days in high school. Winston Churchill was bombed out of his skull on brandy and Cuban cigars during the darkest days of World War II. Hitler, of course, thanks to the advanced technology of Germany, was among the first human beings to turn their brains to cobwebs with amphetamine. He actually chewed on carpets, they say. Yum yum. Mother did not come to Cleveland with Father and me. She was ashamed to leave the house. She was so big and fat. So, I had to do most of the marketing after school. I also had to do most of the housework. She had so much trouble getting around. My familiarity with housework was useful at West Point, and then again when my mother-in-law and then my wife went nuts. It was actually sort of relaxing, because I could see that I had accomplished something undeniably good, and I didn't have to think about my troubles while I was doing it. How my mother's eyes used to shine when she saw what I had cooked for her. My mother's story is one of the few real success stories in this book. She joined Weight Watchers when she was 60, which is my age now. When the ceiling fell on her at Niagara Falls, she weighed only 52 kilograms. This library is full of stories of supposed triumphs, which makes me very suspicious of it. It's misleading for people to read about great successes, since even for middle-class and upper-class white people, in my experience, failure is the norm. It is unfair to youngsters, particularly, to leave them wholly unprepared for monster screw-ups and starring roles in Keystone Cop comedies, and much, much worse. The Ohio Science Fair took place in Cleveland's beautiful Mellencamp Auditorium. The theater seats had been removed and replaced with tables for all the exhibits. There was a hint of my then-distant future in the auditoriums having been given to the city by the Mellencamps, the same coal and shipping family that gave Tarkington College this library. This was a long time before they sold the boats and mines to a British and Omani consortium based in Luxembourg. But the present was bad enough. Even as Father and I were setting up our exhibit, we were spotted by the other contestants as a couple of comedians, as Laurel and Hardy maybe, with Father as the fat and officious one, and me as the dumb and skinny one. The thing was, Father was doing all the setting up, and I was standing around looking bored. All I wanted to do was go outside and hide behind a tree or something and smoke a cigarette. We were violating the most basic rule of the fair, which was that the young exhibitors were supposed to do all the work, from start to finish. Parents or teachers or whatever were forbidden in writing to help at all. It was as though I had entered the soapbox derby over in Akron, Ohio, in a car for coasting down hills that I had supposedly built myself, but was actually my dad's Ferrari Gran Turismo. We hadn't made any of the exhibit in the basement. When, at the very beginning, Father said that we should go down in the basement and get to work, we had actually gone down in the basement. But we stayed there for only about 10 minutes while he thought and thought, growing ever more excited. I didn't say anything. Actually, I did say one thing. "Mind if I smoke?" I said. "Go right ahead," he said. That was a breakthrough for me. It meant I could smoke in the house whenever I pleased, and he wouldn't say anything. Then he led the way back up to the living room. He sat down at Mother's desk and made a list of things that should go into the exhibit. "What are you doing, Dad?" I said. "Shh," he said. "I'm busy. Don't bother me." So, I didn't bother him. I had more than enough to think about as it was. I was pretty sure I had gonorrhea. It was some sort of urethral infection, which was making me very uncomfortable. But I hadn't seen a doctor about it, because the doctor, by law, would have had to report me to the Department of Health, and my parents would have been told about it. As though they hadn't had enough heartaches already. Whatever that infection was, it cleared itself up without my doing anything about it. It couldn't have been gonorrhea, which never stops eating you up of its own accord. Why should it ever stop of its own accord? It's having such a nice time. Why call off the party? Look how healthy and happy the kids are. Twice in later life, I would contract what was unambiguously gonorrhea. Once in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, and then again in Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, in Vietnam. In both instances, I told the doctors about the self-healing infection I had had in high school. It might have been yeast, they said. I should have opened a bakery. So, Father started coming home from work with pieces of the exhibit, which had been made to his order at Barrytron, pedestals and display cases, and explanatory signs and labels made by the print shop that did a lot of work for Barrytron. The crystals themselves came from a Pittsburgh chemical supply house that did a lot of business with Barrytron. One crystal, I remember, came all the way from Burma. The chemical supply house must have gone to some trouble to get together a remarkable collection of crystals for us, since what they sent us couldn't have come from their regular stock. In order to please a big customer like Barrytron, they may have gone to somebody who collected and sold crystals for their beauty and rarity, not as chemicals, but as jewelry. At any rate, the crystals, which were of museum quality, caused Father to utter these famous last words after he spread them out on the coffee table in our living room gloatingly. "Son, there is no way we can lose." Well, as Jean-Paul Sartre said in Bartlett's familiar quotations, hell is other people. Other people made short work of Father's and my invincible contest entry in Cleveland 43 years ago. Generals George Armstrong Custer at the Little Bighorn, and Robert E. Lee at Gettysburg, and William Westmoreland in Vietnam all come to mind. Somebody said one time, I remember, that General Custer's famous last words were, "Where are all these blankety-blank Injuns coming from?" Father and I, and not our pretty crystals, were for a little while the most fascinating exhibit in Mellencamp Auditorium. We were a demonstration of abnormal psychology. Other contestants and their mentors gathered around us and put us through our paces. They certainly knew which buttons to push, so to speak, to make us change color, or twist and turn, or grin horribly, or whatever. One contestant asked Father how old he was and what high school he was attending. That was when we should have packed up our things and gotten out of there. The judges hadn't had a look at us yet, and neither had any reporters. We hadn't yet put up the sign that said what my name was and what school system I represented. We hadn't yet said anything worth remembering. If we had folded up and vanished quietly, right then and there, leaving nothing but an empty table, we might have entered the history of American science as no-shows who got sick or something. There was already an empty table, which would stay empty, only 5 meters away from ours. Father and I had heard that it was going to stay empty, and why. The would-be exhibitor and his mother and father were all in the hospital in Lima, Ohio, not Lima, Peru. That was their hometown. They had scarcely backed out of their driveway the day before, headed for Cleveland, they thought, with the exhibit in the trunk, when they were rear-ended by a drunk driver. The accident wouldn't have been half as serious as it turned out to be if the exhibit hadn't included several bottles of different acids, which broke and touched off the gasoline. Both vehicles were immediately engulfed in flames. The exhibit was, I think, meant to show several important services that acids, which most people were afraid of and didn't like to think much about, were performing every day for humanity. The people who looked us over and asked us questions and did not like what they saw and heard sent for a judge. They wanted us disqualified. We were worse than dishonest. We were ridiculous. I wanted to throw up. I said to Father, "Dad, honest to God, I think we better get out of here. We made a mistake." But he said we had nothing to be ashamed of, and that we certainly weren't going to go home with our tails between our legs. Vietnam! So, a judge did come over, and easily determined that I had no understanding whatsoever of the exhibit. He then took Father aside and negotiated a political settlement, man to man. He did not want to stir up bad feelings in our home county, which had sent me to Cleveland as its champion. Nor did he want to humiliate Father, who was an upstanding member of his community, who obviously had not read the rules carefully. He would not humiliate us with a formal disqualification, which might attract unfavorable publicity, if Father, in turn, would not insist on having my entry put in serious competition with the rest, as though it were legitimate. When the time came, he said, he and the other judges would simply pass us without comment. It would be their secret that we couldn't possibly win anything. That was the deal. History. 5. The person who won that year was a girl from Cincinnati. As it happened, she too had an exhibit about crystallography. She, however, had either grown her own or gathered specimens herself from creek beds and caves and coal mines within 100 kilometers of her home. Her name was Mary Alice French, I remember. And she would go on to place very close to the bottom in the national finals in Washington, D.C. When she set off for the finals, I heard, Cincinnati was so proud of her and so sure she would win, or at least place very high with her crystals, that the mayor declared Mary Alice French Day. I have to wonder now, with so much time in which to think about people I've hurt, if Father and I didn't indirectly set up Mary Alice French for her terrible disappointment in Washington. There is a good chance that the judges in Cleveland gave her first prize because of the moral contrast between her exhibit and ours. Perhaps, during the judging, science was given a back seat, and because of our ill fame, she represented a golden opportunity to teach a rule superior to any law of science, that honesty was the best policy. But who knows? Many, many years after Mary Alice French had her heart broken in Washington, and I had become a teacher at Tarkington, I had a male student from Cincinnati, Mary Alice French's hometown. His mother's side of the family had just sold Cincinnati's sole remaining daily paper and its leading TV station, and a lot of radio stations and weekly papers too, to the Sultan of Brunei, reputedly the richest individual on earth. This student looked about 12 when he came to us. He was actually 21, but his voice had never changed, and he was only 150 centimeters tall. As a result of the sale to the Sultan, he personally was said to be worth $30 million, but he was scared to death of his own shadow. He could read and write and do math all the way up through algebra and trigonometry, which he had taught himself. He was also probably the best chess player in the history of the college. But he had no social graces, and probably never would have any because he found everything about life so frightening. I asked him if he had ever heard of a woman about my age in Cincinnati, whose name was Mary Alice French. He replied, "I don't know anybody or anything. Please don't ever talk to me again. Tell everybody to stop talking to me." I never did find out what he did with all his money, if anything. Somebody said he got married. Hard to believe. Some fortune hunter must have got him. Smart girl. She must be on Easy Street. But to get back to the science fair in Cleveland, I headed for the nearest exit after Father and the judge made their deal. I needed fresh air. I needed a whole new planet, or death. Anything would be better than what I had. The exit was blocked by a spectacularly dressed man. He was wholly unlike anyone else in the auditorium. He was, incredibly, what I myself would become, a lieutenant colonel in the regular army, with many rows of ribbons on his chest. He was in full dress uniform, with a gold citation cord and paratrooper's wings and boots. We were not then at war anywhere, so the sight of a military man all dolled up like that among civilians, especially so early in the day, was startling. He had been sent there to recruit budding young scientists for his alma mater, the United States Military Academy at West Point. The academy had been founded soon after the Revolutionary War because the country had so few military officers with mathematical and engineering skills, essential to victories in what was modern warfare way back then, mainly map-making and cannonballs. Now, with radar and rockets and airplanes and nuclear weapons and all the rest of it, the same problem had come up again. And there I was in Cleveland, with a great big round badge pinned over my heart like a target, which said, Exhibitor. This lieutenant colonel, whose name was Sam Wakefield, would not only get me into West Point. In Vietnam, where he was a major general, he would award me a Silver Star for extraordinary valor and gallantry. He would retire from the Army when the war still had a year to go, and become president of Tarkington College, now Tarkington Prison. And when I myself got out of the Army, he would hire me to teach physics and play the bells, bells, bells. Here are the first words Sam Wakefield ever spoke to me when I was 18 and he was 36. "What's the hurry, son?"